Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a fascinating and rich exploration of the Yoginis, goddesses of Tantra, led by one of the world's leading figures in the public understanding of South Asian art, Professor Vidya Dehejia. My name is Ima Ramos and I'm the curator of the British Museum's current exhibition, Tantra, Enlightenment, Revolution. The show explores how power is central to Tantra, a power described and visualized as feminine and known as Shakti. Tantra introduced many new goddesses into the Hindu and Buddhist pantheons, often ferocious and sexually charged. The Yoginis challenged traditional models of femininity as passive and docile in their intertwining of destructive power and maternal strength. Seductive yet dangerous, these goddesses could shapeshift into women, birds, snakes, and jackals as the mood took them. At the heart of the exhibition is the museum's temple statue of a yogini from Tamil Nadu, alongside an imaginative and immersive recreation of one of the most famous yogini temples in India, located in Hirapur in Odisha and built around the 10th century. Professor Dehejia is Barbara Stoler Miller Professor of Indian and South Asian Arts at Columbia University. She was awarded the Padma Bhushan Award by the Indian government and has also been appointed to the Mario Miranda Visiting Research Professorship at Goa University. Her acclaimed publications include Yogini Cults and Temples, The Body Adorned, and Devi, the Great Goddess, Female Divinity in South Asian Art. In this talk, Professor Dehejia will explore the role of yoginis in medieval India and the visually stunning temple complexes that were built in their honor across India. Following a 30-minute illustrated presentation, she will be joined by playwright, critic, and former British Museum Trustee, Greer, for an exploration of the importance of yoginis within South Asian philosophy and belief.
Hello to all of you, whichever part of the world you might be in. I hear there are a number of you, and I'm delighted at this interest in the subject of Tantra. And my thanks to the BM for this opportunity to share with you my exploration of yogini temples. You all know about temples, and when one speaks of an Indian temple, one conjures up a picture of a tall temple tower, maybe an impressive gateway, all covered with masses of decorative sculpture, for which, of course, India is famous. One imagines halls, perhaps more than one hall, each darker than the one before, leading finally to the sanctum, where the image of the deity is enshrined in a sort of darkened mystery, lit only by the flickering light of oil lamps. But the yogini temples of India present a complete contrast to such a picture. There's no temple tower. In fact, there's no roof at all. Yogini temples are circular enclosures, completely open to the sky. They allow the bright sunlight, or for that matter, moonlight, as well as wind and rain to enter freely. There's no decorative carving at all on the temple walls, as you can see. Rather, these plain blocks of stone could have been put together by a competent stone mason without any aid from a sculptor. There's no impressive gateway. The entrance into the temple is more in the nature of an interruption in the circular wall. And when you enter, you find a series of niches in the circular wall, generally 64 niches. And within each is placed the figure of a female form, a deity, known as a yogini. Is there anything at the center? Well, at the center, there is usually a small pavilion, sometimes open, sometimes closed, that houses an image of God Shiva. So a yogini temple consists of a circle of yoginis surrounding a central Shiva, with this entire group subject to the vagaries of sun, wind, rain, storms. Yogini temples can be small ones like this one at Hirapur, which you just saw in that wonderful visual taken at the BM. Or they can be very much larger, 128 feet in diameter, as you will soon see. And the yoginis themselves, they are beautiful female figures. Nubile bodies, rounded breasts, narrow waists, broad hips, the idealized form of the Indian sculptor. Generally, they have exquisite faces to accompany their curvaceous forms. Look at the glory of this figure. Absolutely exquisite, adorned and a wonderful hairdo pulled to one side of her face. But not always. Here you see a yogini with a horse head. On the right, you see a yogini in which the face has been replaced completely by a snake hood. So you have the cobra hood in place of a head at all. You have fearsome faces, but you also have ones like this rabbit. Absolutely, you wonder how they could be fearsome figures. You wonder how you're scared of some of these figures. You also have them, I think the one on the left is a lion head. It's badly damaged. And on the right, you have this emaciated form with sunken stomach, hanging breasts. You can see the rib cage in between. The face is badly damaged, but I'm sure it was scary. It probably had sunken eyes, open mouth, maybe fangs in the mouth. And what is she holding? In her left hand, she's holding a severed human head. In her right hand, it's damaged, but it's a curved cutlery knife. And with two more heads, she's holding aloft above her head the carcass of a tiger, a very strange heraldic sort of tiger. Yoginis and their temples are feared, as I found out as I started researching them. They evoke a sense of awe, born of fear of invoking the curse of the yoginis. The people feel that almost anything is sufficient to invoke the curse of the yoginis. For instance, even approaching too close to their temples. And in fact, some of the ancient texts like the Jnanarnava Tantra speak of people becoming food for the yoginis if you divulge the secrets of their cult. And this fear existed when I started my research. It existed before that. It's evident in the fact that this particular yogini temple, the Hirapur temple that is sort of, you are seeing in that visual of the British Museum, that temple became known first in the year 1953. Isn't that extraordinary? It's quite close to the capital of the state of Odisha, the temple town of Bhubaneswar. And yet it only became known in 1953. Local villagers must have known about them, but they didn't care to make their knowledge public. Who wanted to risk the curse of the yoginis? This made it, of course, very difficult to research the temples. Nobody wanted to lead me to any of them. I found, too, that the mysteries of the cult had been completely lost over time. No one seemed to know anything about their original significance. And the extent to which the cult had been forgotten is seen in an amusing story I was told at one yogini temple site, not this wonderful little one of Hirapur, but a site that was located upon a low hill. And the story I was told was that the British soldiers who were ruling India at that time chased a group of village women who ran up to the top of this hill. They formed a circle, they prayed to the goddess, And the goddess, in her mercy, rather than allow them to fall into the hands of the British soldiers, turned them into stone. So you can see how much the cult, any information about the cult, had been completely lost. So where was I going to get my information? The one thing was clear, that this was a tantric cult, and I'm using that word lightly here to mean things esoteric and things secret as well, because the yogini texts I finally discovered all have this insistence upon secrecy, that it is the most secret of secret things and it isn't to be divulged casually. So where was I going to find information about this cult? Well, there were tantric practitioners all in many parts of India, particularly in the town of what we used to call Benares, which is now Varanasi. I spent some time looking into this possibility. I had so many questions about these yoginis. But the problem with looking into Tantra as a practice was, first of all, I needed to become an initiate, and I had misgivings on that score. I wasn't sure that my research was going to take that sort of first place in my life. But secondly, the problem was that, assuming I decided to get initiation, I wasn't allowed after that to divulge the secrets of the cult. I remember that ancient text, I would become food for the yoginis. Actually, it wasn't the yoginis I feared so much as modern tantric practitioners, who are a really powerful group of people. But I did have these numerous questions. Who were these yoginis? Where did they fit into this already expansive Hindu pantheon of deities? Why did so many have faces of birds or animals? Why were the temples built as chakras, as circles, as wheels? What manner of people worshipped in these circles? What sort of rites were performed for these yoginis? So where was I to go next? To manuscripts. Manuscript libraries in India, in the days when I was doing my research, which was prior to the internet, prior to cell phones, things that we totally take for granted today. Digitization of manuscripts hadn't happened. There was no such thing as a printed catalog or a catalog online, because online didn't exist. But there were handwritten catalogs. And these were big, huge documents. They contained entries, you had to turn pages like that. They contained entries as manuscripts came into a library. And they were entered not by any title, because there wasn't such a thing, but by the first line of a manuscript. So what was I to rely on? Knowledgeable manuscript librarians. I spent hours and hours talking to manuscript librarians. I drank numerous cups of very sugary tea talking to manuscript librarians who felt they needed to extend hospitality to me. And only the manuscript librarian knows, a good manuscript librarian knows the contents of his collection. What was I looking for? A manuscript first, a tantric manuscript, and then a tantric manuscript that dealt with these yoginis. Speak of looking for a needle in a haystack, it's almost easier to look for the needle. At least you know exactly what that needle looks like. But with my hypothetical manuscript, and by the way, I came across a number of texts of this type, which didn't lead me anywhere. They are namavalis, that is, they are a list of names of the yoginis, 64 of them. And they tell you nothing else. This particular text starts over here with the first one. You get the name and then the number, which is 1. Divya Yogini, Siddha Yogini, Gyaneshwari, it goes on in... what's the use of knowing 64 names, but nothing more about it? So at the end of 2 years, I was just about to give up on this project of mine. More crucially, I should say, my grant was running out. I knew I could write an interesting article on the Yogini temples. When I started out, we knew of 3 Yogini temples. By the time I had wandered the length and breadth of India, I had found a total of 13 temples. So my article could deal with the evolution of sculptural style, starting with the earliest, ending with the latest. Fine, but that's not what I had set out to explore. And then I found my first tantric manuscript dealing with yoginis. I didn't find it in India proper. I found it in Nepal, in Kathmandu, in the Royal Archives, which since then has actually been digitized, but at that time it was not digitized. It was called the Matottere Tantra, Mata Uttara. So a question and an answer Tantra. And once I had found that, it had a sort of a snowball effect. I returned to Benares. I found a copy there. I found the manuscript librarian said to me, "Oh, you want the Matottere Tantra? This has been published by the Chaukamba Sanskrit series right here in this town." And then I found that there were similar manuscripts in the West Coast in Baroda, that there were in Madras in the South, that they were everywhere. And they gave me some of the answers I sought so that I could round out what was going to be just a stylistic study of temples with giving meaning to the actual practices. What did I find out? My first question was, why did people worship the yoginis? And what I found was that the words for salvation, liberation, those were not the sorts of words that occurred in texts on yoginis. What the yogini text focused on was the word siddhi. A siddhi is a magical power, a magical ability. And there are 8 great magical abilities which are, they're so well known in tantric circles, in certain circles, that the text sometimes didn't even bother to explain them. They might list them, but they may not even list them. They would just tell you, if you appropriately worship the yoginis, the 8 great siddhis will be yours. And what are these siddhis? They're immensely powerful, assuming that you're going to take them seriously. There's animan, which is the ability to become minute in size. Maybe you can penetrate an atom or a molecule. There's mahiman, which is the opposite, to become gigantic in size, maybe to move out of our solar system. There's laghiman, which is weightlessness, which could include things like levitation. There's its opposite, gariman, which is great, great weight so that you cannot be moved. There's prakamya, which is an irresistible will. And then there are 2 very interesting ones, ishitva and vashitva. Ishitva means control over body and mind, your own, but also that of others. Think of that power. And vashitva is control over the natural elements, the ability to cause a flash flood, for instance. And then finally, kama vasarita, the fulfillment of all your desires. So these were the 8 great magical abilities that was the powers, this immense power that was the aim of worshipping the yoginis. After that, sometimes it would go on, the text would go on to the black magical abilities, the ability to cause somebody to abandon their home, the ability to cause paralysis in them, the ability even to cause their death, a variety of other things. So they were the immensely powerful goddesses. You had to appropriately worship them in temples. So what is appropriate worship was my next question, which also was answered in the Matottere Tantra text. There is the thing you all know of, which is chanting of mantras, which is sound syllables of one sort or another, Om, Hrim, Glim. so syllables of that sort, but in potent combinations. There were then offerings of wine and offerings of flesh and offerings of blood. And finally, there were offerings of rundas and mundas. What on earth are rundas and mundas? The runda is a headless human body, and the munda is the severed human head. No wonder yogini temples were located in isolated spots like this on top of a hill and in the midst of forest, generally far away from any habitation. The habitation that you're seeing in this view at the bottom is very modern and is part of a whole smuggling ring. Less said about that, the better. So let's consider these yoginis. Wine. Notice that both these yoginis are holding a bowl. It could contain wine, it could also contain blood. The yoginis are described as being particularly fond of wine. The texts describe them as delighting in the pleasure of wine. The phrase is Madhirananda Nandita. They have eyes swaying, rolling through the effect of wine. Mada Gurnita Lochana, the eyes. I found a recipe for the favorite drink of the yoginis, believe it or not. 1 part dried ginger, 2 parts lemon bark, 3 parts black peppercorns, 4 parts dhataki, 5 parts of blossom, 6 parts honey, 8 parts jaggery. Brown sugar, mixed together with water twice the quantity of the honey and brew it for 12 days. Wow, potent stuff, just 12 days. And you have names in these namavalis, these name texts of the yoginis. One of them is called Surapriya, that lover of wine. Another is called Asava Lolupa, she who is greedy for pressed wine. Yoginis have names which describe their drinking blood and eating meat. Rudira Payini, drinker of blood. Mamsa Priya, lover of meat. So the figure on the right here is holding something, is eating something. It could be a piece of meat. What about the rundas and the mundas, the severed human head, the munda that you see? This is the view of the same yogini. On the right, you're seeing her at a slightly different angle so that you can see these severed human heads. Now, let's be quite clear about this. This is not human sacrifice. This is corpse ritual. And the text is very clear, telling you how to select a corpse that is recently deceased, that is perfect in every way, how you bathe it, you anoint it with sandal paste, then you cut off its head and you use it overnight in a ritual. You then, as I found out when I went to sites where such things did happen, they then replaced the head, put lots of garlands around it, gave it back to the family, and would then cremate the body. So let's take stock of, here's one more image for you to look at where you can see the severed human heads being held. I'm not sure if my pointer is working, but it's being held by the figures, the sadhaka, the worshipper. It's a male sadhaka that's being addressed, who's told to take all his courage in his hand and cut off that head for its place in this ritual. So when did the yogini cult emerge? It probably emerged by the 6th century. The temples, the earliest is probably that beautiful little one at Hirapur. Around 800, 850 is probably the earliest temple. Now, you can see that these are clearly outside mainstream Hinduism, that they are tantric. And yet, by the year 900, the yoginis had been brought into the fold of mainstream Hinduism. They figure, their names are listed in texts called the Puranas, which are part of mainstream Hinduism. So you have the Agni Purana and the Skanda Purana. And how did they include the yoginis into this fold? Maybe the outermost fringes of the fold, but how did they do that? Well, one simple answer is that there's always in India this all-encompassing desire to include rather than to exclude. You can turn to, say, something like the avatars of Vishnu and say the Buddha became the 9th avatar. And if you turn today to Kerala, Jesus, Jesu is one of the avatars of Vishnu. So apart from that, how do they do this with the yoginis? They seem to have attempted 2 methods to include them in mainstream Hinduism, and both of them seem to have been successful. One strategy was to describe the yoginis as attendants of the goddess. So when you turn to look at God Shiva, whom you see dancing in the center here, and you see to this lower right, his horde of attendants, they are called ganas, and often they have the heads of birds and animals, as for instance, in this stone image, a gana of Shiva. So if Shiva has his host of gana attendants, it was only but right natural that the goddess whom you see here, Parvati, Uma, Shakti, should have her own set of attendants. And many of these seem to have the heads of birds and animals, as you see here, or again here. There was another method of bringing the yoginis into the central fold. And instead of thinking of them as a more lowly stature, as attendants of the goddess, they also suggested that they were aspects of the goddess, that the goddess had 64 different aspects to her. Here is the goddess, and we will look at this image as I conclude once again. But what you're seeing here is a circle that's sort of superimposed upon her. There are 64 female figures. They are yoginis superimposed, and on them they're wearing slightly different colored garments, so you can see the 64 images, and they've got the name and the number, so they're 1 to 64 and the name that goes with it. And you will see aspects of the goddess is obviously going to be a very much higher status than being just attendants. And that is reflected in some of the yogini temples, where you see these yoginis, the names are inscribed on the pedestal down below here. So here is a yogini who's obviously an aspect of the goddess because she's called Sarvatomukhi, she who looks in all directions. And as you can see, she's got heads in various directions. Or this yogini who is called Antakari, she who brings all things to an end. So this gives the yoginis a much higher stature within this attempt to bring them into mainstream Hinduism. And I want to show you this temple because it's the largest of the temples. The yoginis who are aspects of the goddess are over life size. It's 128 feet in diameter, and you've got this whole circle. And here are the yoginis. They're very, very badly damaged. They belong to a part of India that suffered a great deal of warfare and damage. But you can see the yoginis themselves, and every one of them is actually inscribed. So you have a name. And I want particularly to point you to the yogini on the left here. She's called Kamada, giver of love. And in this case, as you focus on the image itself, it's the giver of sexual love, the giver of female love, love to females. Okay. So I just before sort of talking about what happened to this cult, I just wanted to show you two images from South India. Since I've been talking about Odisha and Central India and Northern India generally up to now, you might think that it was not there in the South, but we do have yoginis in South India as well, in the Chola region. So what happens to this cult? It starts, the first temple may be around the year 850. The cult itself may have emerged around 650. The texts tell us that you can worship the yoginis by drawing a circle in the mud, in the ground. You can worship them by painting them on cloth. You can inscribe them on a sheet of metal, or you can build a temple. A temple means a lot of money, so less temples would have been built. What happens to the cult? It seems to thrive into the 12th century, even into the 13th century. This Yogini temple is at a site called Mitauli, which is near the town of Gwalior in India. And unfortunately, believe it or not, darn it, there's not one single Yogini image left intact in this temple. But we have an inscription of the year 1305, which tells us that worshippers gave lamps to this temple. So it's just for lamps, but the cult must have been, the belief in yoginis, the worship of yoginis seems to have been going on till almost 1300. What's happening in 1300? We have the Delhi Sultanate ruling much of northern India. Very soon thereafter, we will have the Mughals coming in. And what happens to the yoginis and worship of the yoginis? Does it disappear? Well, it seems to recede. Remember, it started by saying you could draw a circle on the ground or on cloth or on any other form. And it seems that the cult, the belief in yoginis, the practice seems to recede. We find a great number of paper chakras, these circles that you're seeing on the top. And there's a lot going on there. There's astrological stuff going on there, but I'm ignoring all that and only pointing you to this circle, which is the detail that you're seeing here. And what you have is the circle of yoginis. The number 3 is the same in the Indian script and in the English script. So here you have the yogini number 33, then there's 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, it goes on. And the same thing over here. Here is the chakra of yoginis. So instead of worshiping in the temples themselves, you could in fact worship privately, perhaps in your own home, without having the money to build a temple, without drawing attention to all of that. You could continue to worship the yoginis in private. And we also have these paper diagrams, mostly come from Rajasthan, from the region of Jaipur and Udaipur and Jodhpur, which many of you will know about. And here is a yogini. Instead of a chakra, it's a square this time, but superimposed upon the goddess now. So you have the goddess standing there with a variety of weapons in her own hands, and superimposed upon her is the square formation with 1, 2 starting here. It's a magic square, so the numbering is different also. The idea that the yoginis are in fact perhaps aspects of the goddess herself. And the yoginis in a way change from being the goddesses who are going to give you those types of siddhis. There are texts, 19th century texts in the region of Mumbai, which says that the yoginis are protectresses of children. And that means immediately that every single woman is going to worship the yoginis in these sort of diagrams. Here's a close-up in black and white in which you can actually see the figures of the yoginis a little bit better. So aspects of the goddess, attendance of the goddess, Shakti, power, importance. This is where I am happy to end and open it up to Bonnie, who is our wonderful moderator and is going to take over from me now. Thank you.
Vidya, if I may, Thank you so much. And I spent the entire 30 minutes of this lecture smiling. I just couldn't stop. And I'm thinking, why am I smiling besides this beautiful information? You know, I'm raising my hand to say I'm from that 60s generation of young Black women, African-American women, who, because of the civil rights movement and seeing our older brothers and sisters and our parents doing sit-ins, getting, you know, sort of water hosed by sheriffs, beaten up, shot, and living in a very strict Judeo-Christian environment, because African Americans are very Christian. Even if they don't practice it, that is the whole milieu. So then suddenly comes a picture of the Beatles in India with the Maharishi. They're sitting there sort of garland. There's the Rolling Stones, all of this. And my generation, some of my generation of women, particularly Black women, decided we were going to cross over to this new world. And this world of the Yoginis seemed to give to us, take us away from guilt and the kind of Judeo-Christian arc and the male God into another space that empowered us as females, as women, our bodies, because of course we were brought up very modestly to not show our bodies. And you growing up, coming of age in the 60s and on the street, we stopped wearing our brassieres, we stopped doing all of this. And so what makes me smile is I grew up in Chicago, and I'm thinking of Shaka Khan, who is she completely embodied the sort of idea of woman power, Black woman power, yogini, you know, standing on stage, opening your body out, opening your legs, you know, standing there, which is we were taught not to do. So it's, first of all, that made me smile. And of course, in a sense, during the lockdown, these yoginis have returned to me, which is another story, but it's a wonderful story. But also, one of the things that Ramos has said about the beautiful exhibition at the British Museum, she is a curator, has organized Enlightenment to Revolution. She wants to take Tantra away from, in a way, what my generation did to it, which was to take out the sacred and just take out the sexual elements of it without the sacred attached to it. So then our Tantra has been handed down to subsequent generations in a kind of debased way. Can you speak to that in a sense, those two things, the element of how the Yogini liberated women, 60s women, baby boomer women, huge liberation for us. And also at the same time, how Tantra became abused by my generation as well.
Well, there's something about all imagery in India, not just the yogini, all female imagery in India, in which you can see that the body is not something to be hidden. It's not something to be covered up. You look at the Venus de Milo, and she has got one hand down here and one hand here. She's sort of partly covering her body. Her shoulders are turned inwards as if there's something that she needs to hide. And then you look at images earlier than that, much earlier than that, and you see the opening up of the body. You see the yogic posture. When you look at the rear view of some of these images, other images that you can actually see in rear view, you see that spinal column clearly. It is open. It's an open body. It's a body that faces the world and is proud to face the world. So there is that part of it that is there in Indian imagery. And you know, the odd thing is that it's very difficult to separate the sacred from the sensuous. The sensuous is also, the sacred is also sensuous. In other words, the idea in India seems to have been that you cannot have spirituality without at the same time having bodily beauty. And therefore all the deities are beautiful, and beauty of the body is one way to approach the Godhead, by reveling in the beauty, which is also the spiritual power of that goddess or of the god. That is a major way of approaching the Godhead. Yes, of course, there are other ways. You can go renunciation, you can go meditation, you can do all of that, but just reveling in physical bodily beauty is one path to the divine. So,
and it is also the opposite of it's the opposite in a sense of, and as you say, of this whole Judeo-Christian arc in which the woman's body, genitalia, breasts, everything are hidden, are not celebrated, are not shown, are not seen as centers of power, potential power, of real power. And the feminine is not seen as a source of immense power, of life, of death. I mean, when we loved back in the day the fact that they had guys' heads, not necessarily to take their heads off, but to show that women could have that kind of power too, of themselves. It wasn't bestowed on them by anybody. It was of themselves, from our own bodies, from the bodies we were taught to hide, from the bodies we were taught to cover up and not make of ourselves. Do you find?
How fortunate. Sorry.
No, go on.
How fortunate we are that we were created with this miraculous ability to create life. I mean, is that not the most wonderful gift that could have been given to women? The ability to create that life? Yeah, it requires the intervention of men, but that ability to create it is woman's joy alone. Pain as well, but joy alone.
Well, before we go to questions, just one observation. We talked about this before we came into questions. You just mentioned about power and women's power. Of course, we know that the Democratic Party's vice presidential candidate is named Kamala, is one of the names of the goddess Lakshmi, and her middle name is also Devi. So it's interesting to see in a kind of way that the goddess is there. And when she made her comment, "I'm speaking," which became a meme and went viral, it was for me a kind of culmination of that time when my generation of Black women were thinking about how are we women and how are we powerful outside of that sort of Judeo-Christian arc. And now we have Kamala. Hopefully she will be in the White House. Let's go to questions and let's see if I can do this, because I'm very horrible about this. Here's the first one. Is this is from Jan Vidya. Were the makers of these images mostly men?
Probably. Most workshops, so you had guilds and workshops, and people were apprenticed to the workshop from an early age. There were certainly girl children around, but and we had the names of a few women who were sculptors, but very few. So I think largely girl children were allowed to work in workshops until they became of marriageable age, and then they went into they didn't seem to, very few of them became professionally known and signed their name on a piece of sculpture. So it would have been mostly men.
This question I want to ask within that question, were the men, the males who worked in the temples, created temples, was this sort of creation or impulse to create or need to create, was it ritualized? Was it part of the culture itself? How how were men able to create these incredibly powerful female images with male heads hanging?
I think they were professionals. They were real artists. They were professional artists. They worked in these workshops, and they were given a variety of commissions. And I've been able to trace the same hand in a Shiva temple and then in a Buddhist monastery, meaning that they were not necessarily involved with the ritual themselves personally. Of course, there was ritual. Any temple had to have, there were priests and there was ritual which was involved before you started building, and then when you finished building, that type of ritual. But the actual people did not have to believe. The fact that they could create such wonderful, powerful images speaks to their professionalism as stone carvers more than to their actual belief systems, because you can see the same hand in different areas.
It's interesting because when one looks at cathedrals, for instance, and the times I've been in Notre Dame, for instance, in Paris, you get a very strong sense of personal faith. I know some of them were professionals, but you also get a sense, because they carved little things inside the statues, their little sort of faces and their thoughts. But you get a sense of personal faith. And you say that for the carvers of these images, it was their job, is what they did. And they knew how to do that.
I honestly believe so, only because I think that I can quote 3 or 4 examples where I can put something from 2 different religious contexts together and say that's the same person. He's doing a beautiful carving at a Buddhist monastery, and he's also doing one on a Shiva temple. So because of that, obviously there must always have been people who believed in what they were carving. But I think that by and large, they were professionals who worked for whoever commissioned them, and they gave their very best.
It's amazing.
To make them. But
it's amazing. Another question, why the fascination for death, decay, human heads, and bodies?
That's a difficult question. There are many ways of answering that, which of course is, one of them is seeing that the body is important. It's important. It is only through being in a body that you can get ultimate salvation. We've got stories in India about goddesses asking to be born on earth because it's only through the human experience that you can experience that absolute bliss of salvation, that bliss that comes when you arrive at a certain stage. So if you can have a goddess saying, let me be born on earth so that I can experience that delight. So you see, the body is important in many ways. In some ways, and in Buddhist faith, not here, it's also because you see what the body can become when it's after death. But it's not quite that. It's a very difficult question. I don't know the answer to it. It's possible that a tantric who actually worships will be able to answer that better, because you are being told not to focus on the bad things about that, but you've got to get this beautiful body, and you've got to take that head and use it in your meditation overnight, for one night. It's only for one night that you have to do this, and to understand. So it's a complex one. It's not an easy question to answer.
May I ask sort of an appendage to that? If we, and this is just right off the top of my head, so let me just do it. The CDs are powers. These are things that are given, and they are I guess, transcendent powers. They are powers beyond the body, beyond ordinary things, beyond being in this body. Would it be possible to say, would it be possible to say that the decay is about looking at the opposite of that reality, knowing that that is the other side of it, that's the other side of it itself?
Yes, in some way, it is meant to be a transformative experience. It's very difficult for us as human beings who haven't engaged in Tantra in a serious way to understand, I think, the significance of that transformative experience. We are willing to accept it as a fact, but we don't understand it because we don't know how to experience it, I think. It's an important experience, and it's definitely part of Yogini Tantra. You know, there are many different types of Tantra, and there are forms of Tantra in which there are sexual rites involved. In Yogini Tantra and Yogini temples, there aren't the sexual rites. Instead, you're having this whole thing of the head, the severed head and the human body. You know, this is the other problem with Tantras. The texts never explain why. They just tell you how you should do something. And so that's why the whole Indian tradition insists that you need a guru. You need a person who personally guides you and therefore answers all those questions, which it's one thing to be a scholar and to find a text and put it all together. And then there's another thing to actually know the experience, and having experienced it yourself. And that's when you need the guru.
Next question is, thank you, Vidya. If gods and goddesses were believed to be perfection, would it not be logical for them to be illustrated in beauty? And maybe you've answered that in a way, but.
They do, they are. They're always beautiful, because spiritual perfection and physical perfection went hand in hand. You know, if you look at the Buddhist text, they're very specific about it. They tell you that there are 32 forms of superhuman perfection that the Buddha had. And there's a text that tells you he got this because he did this. He never got angry with anybody in his previous life. He got this lion body because he gave generously in his previous life. There's a whole text that goes through it. So those two are very much connected.
Thank you. The next question, is the Yogini cult extinct now? Are Yogini temples being built in the modern era?
No, it seems to have been something which was popular, say, between about 600 of this era and maybe up to 1300, and then it seems to have receded. There is also this thing about Tantra, that there is a right-handed Tantra and a left-handed Tantra. The left-handed Tantra treats everything literally that you see in the texts and everything. Right-handed Tantra has a substitute for each of those. So if you were to say you have to offer blood in left-handed Tantra, those people who follow that type of Tantra would offer blood. The right-handed Tantra would offer a blood red hibiscus flower in place of blood. So it's probable that the Tantra that is practiced more frequently would be the right-handed Tantra, where there are substitutes being used for what is actually done literally in the heyday of the belief system. But it seems that after about 1300, it seems to have receded. It's obviously there because you wouldn't get 19th century texts saying you got to worship the 64 yoginis, they protect your children. there's been a change, there's been a shift. It's not surprising because in India, religion has always changed and moved and adapted with the sort of times so that you could still practice it, but in a slightly different form, which was more acceptable.
The next question, Vidya, who are the sponsors of these different temples?
Interestingly, we do not have any institutional material. They have to have been extremely wealthy people who could pay a really fine workshop to create these images. It costs a lot to build a temple. And that means that there was significant portions of the population, wealthy part of the population. It must have been very popular at one time. The fact that we have been able to find remnants of 13 of these across India, there must have been many more. For instance, the text, the Matotare Tantra that I found in the Kathmandu library, which was handwritten, and there were multiple copies of it. And in a day and age where there was no printing press, there was no Xerox machine, there was no phone to copy, you hand copied. To have multiple hand copies of a text is quite significant when you consider the day and age in which it literally had to be, somebody had to sit down and hand copy it. It implies the importance of the text, and therefore it also seems to imply the importance of the yoginis. And if there were so many copies in Nepal and we haven't found a yogini temple there, it's got to have been there, but it seems it has been destroyed at some stage. And you can understand why too, because it must have, it's so powerful that it would have frightened people, maybe.
Vidya, this is my question. This is the last one. You are so passionate about this. It's very moving and amazing to watch and to listen. You're also the world expert on this. So this is a great privilege for all of us. Why do you do it? Because I'm asking you this, because the world we live in, the world of your university as well, is a very black and white world. I mean, it is a Judeo-Christian heaven, hell. You go up there, you go down here. Is the good, is the bad, is it blah, blah. How this has been your life's work. Why is this in this world?
You know, the funny thing is that I often say that I'm not a believer. And I remember something my mother said. She said, never mind the number of temples and sacred spaces that you have spent your life in. You must have done something in your previous life that pushed you into something like this. And you still, I mean, I am passionate about it, but I still am. There are times when I get overcome by something like my current project, which is completely different from Yogini. It's a desire to, well, think about it. The fact that in parts of the world, it is monotheism. There's only one way. There's only one path. And India always thought in terms of multiple paths. And if I can bring it down to something absolutely absurd, you want to get in London to the British Museum. Okay, so you can take this subway line and walk that way. You can get down at Tottenham Court Road and walk, or you can get down at Russell Square and you can walk, or you can take a cab to get to the British Museum. You can walk. There are many ways to get to the goal. What we are showing is that the goal is usually the same. It's some sort of belief in some sort of salvation, maybe, but there are many ways to get to it. So one way could be the Yoginis. And for somebody else, you know, you say, oh, I'm not going to Russell Square. I've got to get into a lift that goes up and down. I'm going to Tottenham Court Road instead. So, you know, it's which way approach. Every one of them gets you there. which way are you going to take? So, it's partly that belief that monotheism is one route, but that there are multiple paths that can get you there, which I feel very strongly about, which is probably why I get excited and involved with the art of the religion that I'm dealing with. And I don't have to be a personal believer at all. I can still be 100% enthusiastic.
I have to say, personally, and on behalf of the British Museum and our listeners, I thank you so much for this, for being with us. Thank you so much for the privilege of this lecture and of your scholarship and your beauty and your excitement of this. And also thank you for being one of the ornaments of a beautiful, beautiful exhibition at the museum, Enlightenment to Revolution. Thank you very much for being with us, Vidya Dehejia, Professor. And I will never forget this. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for so superbly taking it over and making it come to life. Thank you.
Thank you for everything. And we our fingers crossed for Kamala. So thank you.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. And thank you, questioners. Thank you very much.